Welcome to Revisiting the Vault, a podcast where we're looking at the history of art, animation, music, and just about everything else, but through a Disney lens. I am Mary Ratliff. I am a writer and visual artist / film nerd.
And I am Gretchen Harwell, and I am a mom. I am a veterinary technician. I have worked on a deer one time.
I was going to say, the vet tech thing is actually really relevant this time.
Sort of.
Kind of. As we said, this movie, we've gotten to the point where we are watching Bambi. Mm-hmm. But before we move on to Bambi, I do want to point out the couple things I learned about Dumbo.
Yes.
So I was, out of curiosity, I waded into TV Tropes, which I don't know if you've been on tvtropes.com before. Mm-mm. Okay, well, nope. Only do it if you have a very long time to spend on the internet, because it is a rabbit hole of all rabbit holes. You follow it and you fall in holes after holes, and you're just like, it's days. You usually emerge after days. So anyway, I went on TV Tropes because I was interested in what they called the magic feather moment in Dumbo.
Right.
And Dumbo is the trope namer for it. It is called the magic feather trope.
Okay.
So there you go. But while I was there, again with the rabbit holes, this is what they're best at. I discovered that I should have known this, that Jumbo was not just a name that a lot of people give elephants. Like, I was like, oh, Jumbo, an elephant. It's like Spot for a dog.
Right.
It's just a Fido kind of thing. No, there was a specific Jumbo the circus elephant in the 1880s who was very, very famous. It was one of P.T. Barnum's. And there are some people who say that Dumbo is supposed to be that Jumbo's son, which does not track at all because that Jumbo died after getting hit by a train. He died in the 1880s.
That's terrible.
His skeleton is in the Natural History Museum in New York City.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's on display or just in their collections. They took his hide and stuffed it and continued using it as a sideshow attraction because it's P.T. Barnum.
Gross.
Yeah. That hide / taxidermied elephant eventually ended up at Tufts University, where Jumbo is their mascot, but it was destroyed in a fire.
I thought there might be a Tufts connection. I have a friend who went to Tufts, and he has told me about Jumbo the elephant. So strange.
That taxidermy Jumbo was destroyed in a fire. Ashes from that fire now reside in a Peter Pan peanut butter jar in the athletic director's office.
Gross.
It's so weird. I was just like, this is the weirdest story. So there's your word. But this adds to my galaxy brain theory. Jumbo was an African elephant, and Mrs. Jumbo was an Asian elephant. Mm-hmm. Maybe Dumbo misdelivered.
Maybe so. Maybe that's why it took so long for him to get there.
Yeah.
The stork got lost on the way.
But another interesting fact, actually, sorry, I'm so full of interesting facts tonight, but...
Go for it.
When we call things jumbo size, like where I thought, oh, Jumbo, an elephant, because he's jumbo size. No, we call things jumbo sized because of that elephant.
There it is. I mean, it all tracks once you know it all, except for the Tufts stuff. That's just weird. So I looked up Deems Taylor because when you told me about it, I was like, well, surely I have heard of this man. What is happening in my world? Because I was a music major. I very, very briefly considered doing my master's in musicology. And so I looked him up and I was like, why was he not all over my education? Well, I'll tell you why. He started out as a composer. And when he was born and when he was composing all this stuff, he wrote a lot of stuff that was in the post-romantic style, which everything was already moving toward modernism and like modern music. And so it got a lot of enthusiasm right when it came out. And then everybody kind of forgot about him because they were like, well, music has changed. And he actually wrote several operas. He was very well received. He was the most performed American opera composer for the Metropolitan Opera. He really was a big deal. But that being said, he really kind of got marginalized because of the style he was writing in. And then he did go on to do a lot of music criticism and music essays. And there's an ASCAP award named for him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But because he was really kind of forgotten, that's not a kind way to put it, but as a composer. And then I was like, well, why didn't I know about him? It's because I spent all of like a day and a half considering whether or not I wanted to go into musicology, and I didn't. So I probably would have learned about him had I gone into that.
Yeah, he's in the 201 classes, not the 101 classes.
Exactly.
He did know what he was talking about. He just maybe had a bad script.
Well, and like you had mentioned in that episode where we discussed it, I did also read that all of his stuff was re-recorded by someone else. It was re-recorded for the 2010 re-release.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing where the road shows were released, all of it was re-recorded by another person because his was gone.
Yeah, I'm almost certain that his original audio is not. I know some people talked about trying to restore it, was what I read, but I don't think that they found enough of it.
And that is also, they said, a lot of his commentary was severely shortened. So anyway, we can let Mr. Taylor rest in peace now.
Yes.
We have discussed him. Let's talk about Bambi.
So Bambi, our brief background on Bambi, released August 21st, 1942. It did not make back its budget at the time because it was 1942. It's based on an Austrian book, which I'm sure we'll get into in a minute. But I feel like the European market actually would have been really good for Bambi because it was a very big hit there, but they couldn't release there because Europe was, in the middle of a war zone.
Right.
So it didn't make back its money until its first re-release, but it did make it back the first time it went back into the theaters in 1947. Critically acclaimed. Walt Disney actually said that it was his favorite. And I think I can see why.
Sure.
Disney's pretty well known as an animal lover. We're not going to talk about it on this podcast, but the Disney animal documentaries are not great in that they actually staged a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Disney being an animal lover and making those animal documentaries, you can understand why he would love Bambi, but I also don't want to be like, Disney made all of these wonderful nature films, because they're not actually that wonderful.
Right. And honestly, there are parts of this movie, we will get to it, where I just felt like, just right out of the gate, I enjoyed it.
Right.
A ton more than I thought I would.
Of the 5 we've watched, it's my favorite.
Same. With that being said, but there are parts where there's still not a ton of story. And there are parts where I was like, I feel like I'm watching a year in the life of a fawn.
Right. Which, well, that's what the book was.
Yeah. So, but it feels almost like an attempted, animated documentary of sorts. It's not what it is, but that's what it felt like. But it was, I enjoyed it.
And it's funny because, I completely forgot it was based on a book until it popped up on the screen, which is weird because I've read the book.
Yeah. The
book became really popular in the US when it became part of the Book of the Month Club. And I'm pretty sure that's the copy that we had at home.
Mm-hmm.
I can picture it in my head. It was with this set of similar ones. It was identical to our copy of Missy of Chincoteague, which is a very formative book from my youth. So
sure.
Bambi, really, the book is darker, unsurprising. The whole idea of Disneyfying a short story or a book or a myth or whatever, it comes from things like the fact that they took something like what the book is and made it cute little animals. Because the book doesn't really hold back on how terrible it is sometimes to be a deer,
right,
to be an animal that is being hunted. Although I think it's interesting to note that the man who wrote it, Felix Salten, was a hunter.
Yes.
Now, this was written in 1923, so that was actually probably a lot more common.
Sure.
It's interesting to me because it ties into this sort of historical thing where Bambi is considered one of the first environmental novels, and the animation is also considered to be maybe not one of the first, but one of the strongest, sort of environmentalism messages, to the point where there's a whole thing called the Bambi effect,
right,
where people care more about animals if they're cute. It's interesting to me that back in the 20s and in these early environmentalist movements, a lot of those movements were actually coming from hunters.
And that actually, there is still that mentality among hunters. I have a lot of hunters in my families, and when I was looking up some of the stuff for this movie, a lot of the information I got came from preservationist hunters. They were like, if you want to have a good, a solid deer population, then they go all the way through it.
I don't really have a problem with hunting just across the board. Same with a lot of hunters being in my family. Grew up in the rural South, in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. Obviously, lots of white-tailed deer, lots of people hunting white-tailed deer. But I think that it's worth separating out the people that do the big game trophy hunting and the people who do deer hunting.
Right. All of my family who hunt, they're not also trophy hunting. They're hunting to feed themselves.
Right. Subsistence hunting is a thing because venison actually, if you are an omnivore, venison is pretty delicious. It's very lean and it's good for you.
Yes.
If you're a vegetarian, obviously, I guess content warning.
Right.
The other thing is, again, if you talk about the Bambi effect, Deer populations do need to be controlled.
Yeah.
Where I live up here in Northern Virginia, like we're just covered in white-tailed deer.
Yeah, we have deer in our yard weekly.
Yeah.
You know, I have a big backyard and the part of it is treated like a superhighway for the animals. We have coyotes, we have foxes, we have deer, we've got a pair of groundhogs named Chubbles and Bubbles. There's everything back there, and including deer.
Yeah. But in Bambi, first of all, man is never seen, but also they are in the deep forest.
Mm-hmm.
It looks to me like it is not meant to be contemporary with 1942 when it was released. Who knows? I don't think they really say.
I don't know that it even really matters.
Which is good, I think, actually, because I think that lends to it feeling a lot more timeless. In a way that the other movies weren't able to because they're very clearly set in a time and a place. You know, white-tailed deer are native to a whole lot of the U.S. They're very common. So you're not sitting there looking like, oh, this is a species that's only in this one corner of Connecticut.
Right.
Going back to the book. Interesting thing about the book that I'm not going to go all in on this because I didn't find anything of Sultan speaking about it himself. But Sultan was Jewish and he was in Austria. And so he did actually have to flee from the Nazis.
Right.
He changed his name. He was born Sigmund Saltzman. He had to flee to, I believe, Switzerland. And so there are a lot of people and literary critics who say that the book is actually an allegory about anti-Semitism. To the point where the Nazis believed it was and banned and burned it.
Which is, at that point, it kind of makes it true regardless if it was or not.
Exactly.
I do agree that his intent does matter, absolutely. But in a practical sense where you say, well, perception is reality, if the people who are hunting and killing Jews think it's about that, then you better act like it is.
That was sort of something that really took me aback when I started. So what I tend to do with how we do this is I tend to watch it with very little preparation so that I can sort of just see the movie, like, not completely fresh, but fresh-ish.
Right.
And so that's what I did with this one. And so reading about this and seeing that the book Bambi was banned and burned by Nazis was just like what in the world? Because, like, so here's the thing. This is a momentous occasion, Gretchen. We should circle this on our calendars. We should have a party and celebrate it. There's no racism in this movie.
I know, there's not even a content warning. But, you know, I would say it's possible that the Nazis burned it and banned it because he was a Jewish author.
It is possible, yes.
It's entirely possible that it had nothing to do with what they thought his intent was. He was a Jewish author. Done.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't have to go further than that. It could be both. It could be one or the other. I don't know.
If someone is a literary historian and wants to, like, come in and, like, give us the receipts and tell us about it, I found it very fascinating. There's also a lot of really interesting copyright stuff happening with this author that I loved reading about, but almost no one else would enjoy me talking about.
Right.
Just to sort of come back around to the actual making of, Walt Disney was given this book. He loved it, I believe. The rights were actually bought by Sidney Franklin, who was a producer who was planning to make a live-action version of it. And then he realized that, like, that was never going to happen. And so then he gave the rights to Disney, sold the rights to Disney. He didn't give them. He's not that magnanimous, but he sold the rights to Disney to do the animated version. And that all happened right after Snow White. That was not that late. And this was supposed to be their second feature. This was what they wanted to do, but they wanted to do a more realistic art style for the animals, and it just took them forever.
Well, but it was worth the wait.
It was absolutely worth the wait.
If you look at Dumbo's animation,
it
is a dumpster fire compared to this.
It's literally from the first frame.
Yeah.
It is beautiful. They had done some life studies before, but sort of famously, they got a couple fawns from, I believe, a zoo that they studied their movements. And they actually, like, got the animals and watched them so that they get some of the movements more correct. There are plenty of things that they get wrong in here when it comes to, like, the actual animal stuff.
Sure.
There are so many things that they got so right that I think
the quail.
The
quails are so good.
I think that's why you get the Bambi effect. That's why it's called the Bambi effect, because this is a movie where they anthropomorphize the animals by making them speak, by having them have more human emotions.
Half of them walk on two legs.
Right. They did a lot of things that made them more human-like, but they also kept so much of their animalness that it made it sort of more easy to translate to feel like that's also true in real life.
I think they really hit that balance of just enough anthropomorphizing with still retaining their animal selves that you can willingly buy into it. Even if there is stuff you're like, oh, come on. There were things that we will get to them. But I'm still completely willing to buy in.
The one that calls to mind the most when I want to think about their movements is absolutely the beginning of Drip, Drip, Drop.
Yep.
Just that his ears twitching, just swiveling just a little bit, his head tilting, like those little movements, those small movements, those are the ones where they make it realistic. And also when his mom goes out to the meadow.
And she's stretching her neck and she's looking and she's turning and she's looking and she's sniffing the air and then she takes another step.
Anybody who has deer in their backyard has seen it.
Or even in my house, we can see them from our back door. As soon as you notice the deer, and you don't even really have to open the door, you can just stand there. She will turn her head and look at you and flick those ears and she's just like, I see you. She knows. It's remarkable and they nailed it.
Absolutely. The deer especially. The quail also. Those adorable, tragic quail.
Oh, those poor quail.
In the opening, the little mouse waking up and getting the dewdrop to like wash his face. The little mouse who lives in like a nest. They just show so many things. And they are definitely like Disney-fied. They're pretty cute. The birds don't really look like birds. Most of the birds are a very distinct Disney bird. They look like the
Snow White birds.
They really do. The owl could have been way more realistic. He's definitely more cartoonized. But I feel like there's probably really good reasons for that, considering that I'm a person who grew up watching Secrets of NIMH, and the owl in that is terrifying.
Yeah. He is kind of like he's not a narrator.
Yeah, he's sort of meant to be the adult in the room.
Yeah, he's like the elder statesman is what I was going to say. Yeah, he is. And so when you look to him, you don't necessarily want him to look exactly like an owl.
Right.
He's kind of crotchety. He's fine, and I don't mean that as a dismissive way.
If you look up his voice actor frequently plays that sort of comedic, older, grumpy character.
Yeah.
I saw a picture of him and I was like, yeah, that's that guy.
Yep.
There are several characters in this that are hitting some tropes. Thumper. I remember absolutely adoring Thumper when I was a kid. I do still like Thumper. I think that I see a little bit more of a complicated depth to his character now where I'm like, Thumper, you're the bad kid.
Yes. There were times where I was watching it and I thought, he is a bad influence. But then nothing really high stakes bad happens. There's a part where he sounds like Eddie Haskell from Leave It to Beaver. I'm watching it and I wrote down, Thumper feels like a bad influence.
Yeah.
And he's ultimately not really.
He's like saying you don't have to eat your vegetables. That's like as bad as he gets.
Right. Yeah.
But I did spend the whole movie waiting for Thumper to lead Bambi to do something that was going to get Bambi in trouble.
Yes.
It felt like that was going to happen.
He comes across kind of like he's going to be the Lampwick character.
Right.
And he's not. He's not at all.
And there was one point where I wrote that he sounded like someone trying to sound like they're a kid.
Right.
But apparently the voice actor was a 4-year-old who was auditioning for Bambi, the role of Bambi, and didn't get it, but they liked him for Thumper, and then they thought he was so adorable that they actually expanded Thumper's part.
I have to say, though, I found a lot of the kid voices, I did look up a lot of the voice actors, and many of them were the same person over and over and over again. And I'm guessing at some points that person plugged their nose, because the kid voices, to a certain extent, got on my nerves in that they sounded like they were congested.
And I think that's what hit me with Thumper, where I thought that he sounded like someone trying to sound like a kid. It probably was that sort of weird, stuffy nose sort of thing. And I do want to note, though, there have been some great podcasts and like news stories about it, so we don't need to get too far into it. But the fact that the voice of young Bambi became a drill sergeant never told anyone
that he was Bambi,
because he didn't want them to call him Sergeant Bambi.
Right. Well, fair.
Yeah.
Fair, fine.
I read a thing with an interview with him that I have to say that it's one of the most badass quotes I've ever heard, where they asked him about his military service, and he said, I have a couple holes in my body that God didn't give me.
Hey, he's not wrong.
That's a way to look at it. But yeah, I mean, he sounds like a really cool dude. Definitely people should look up some of his NPR interviews and stuff. You know, most of the other voice actors it's just sort of the kind of people that are in a lot of things, have a lot of credits.
Yes. I looked up several of them. I noticed some of them, they overlapped in parts of the career. More than one was on Twilight Zone. I think a couple of them were on Gunsmoke. There was more than one that was on Andy Griffith. And then the guy who did adult Bambi's voice, Hardy Albright, he was on Leave It to Beaver, which I was like, Eddie Haskell! And he was on Dennis the Menace. And in both of those, he was playing an adult, because this was, 20 years later. But I was like, I don't know why, because I can buy it 100%. Also, I more than once Bambi's mom sounded to me like Barbara Billingsley.
She sounded so familiar in so many places that when I looked her up, I was like, I have to know who this is. But the only other thing that I knew her from is that she's Mrs. Jetson, which is just, okay.
Right. And I mean, maybe that's what I'm actually hearing in my head, but just, I think it was more her manner of speaking. And when she says, oh, you're not afraid, are you? It's that kind of almost mid-Atlantic accent, but not really. It's like the California version of the mid-Atlantic accent. So all those other things that happen in her pattern of speech when she speaks, I was like, she sounds like Barbara Billingsley.
I think that they were doing, and maybe it was a conscious choice, but probably not. I think that they were playing into some sort of tropes in the acting.
Oh, totally.
So that you just sort of were like, oh, this is that character, so that you could continue the anthropomorphizing. Mm-hmm. The mom was the mom that you've seen a bunch of times. Thumper is the bad kid, or, the not so bad kid. Right. I think that they were sort of doing that. And it does come across in the voice acting. There wasn't anything that I would say was like a standout job on the acting, but none of it was bad.
Yes. And now is as good a time as any. Let's talk about a couple of these names.
Yeah.
So Faline, every time I heard it, I was like, how are they spelling this? It's Faline. Faline.
Yeah, well, I had my subtitles on, so I guess my brain just sort of connected it right away with how it was spelled.
Am I the only one that thinks it's weird that Bambi's a boy, grows up to be a buck? Nowadays, you associate Bambi as a girl's name.
My sense, really, mostly, was that it was something where because he was Austrian, it was in the 1920s in that time, and that maybe it just sort of read differently. I do want to point out about his name, though, that when she says what she's going to name him, and then Thumper makes a face, and I'm like, we are not doing this again. We just did this with Dumbo. We're not doing this again.
Right.
And then he says, yeah, I think that'll work out okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. That's what everybody should have said for Dumbo.
Yeah, quit second guessing the mom here, you jerks. Yeah. She just had a baby.
Which also, comparing it to Dumbo, there are no storks here.
Thank goodness.
There were no discussions of the miracle of life or whatever, because it's just, hey, the prince has been born.
Let's go see him.
Let's go see him. And then everyone is 100% exactly like how everyone reacts to a newborn.
Oh, yes.
So one of my friends just had a baby, and we had to get together, and she brought the baby. And it was fresh on my mind. And like Owl coming in and being like, woohoo, woohoo.
Yes.
Everybody does that.
Yeah, it's like the classic grandpa with the keys. It is very cute. And like having had a child and hated everyone for a while afterward, I could just feel Bambi's mom.
Yeah.
And she's sitting there and she just has to inside being like, yeah, he's cute. Go away.
Again, I'm not a mom, but I remember when my best friend had her baby, and that first week,
it's brutal.
If you had somebody coming by being like, hey there, and you're just like, let them sleep. So when all the forest animals are like gathering together and like, the prince is born, they're all being really loud. I am just like, Bambi's mom hates this.
Yes. She is going to headbutt them all.
That whole bit, that's very accurate to how humans react to newborns. It's also, I think, the way they show Bambi starting to try to walk, like getting his legs a little tangled up. Very cute. Seems pretty accurate. Although at one point, they sort of have a thing that feels like it's weeks later. I don't know how long that time frame is supposed to be with that one, but they're like, oh, he's walking already. And I'm like, most animals walk within, like, days.
A lot of them are born precocious. Like,
right.
A giraffe, you mentioned the other day, a giraffe it falls to the ground and it's got to get up. Horses, same. Mm-hmm. They have to be able to get up because it's over if they don't.
It's a rough world.
Yeah. I really loved the beginning shot, the way it's really dark, but then there are certain things that are sort of highlighted and it almost feels like it's in 3D.
Yeah. They're using the multiplane camera to very good effect.
Oh, gosh, it was so good. And you can see, when you just look at this movie compared to Dumbo and even Fantasia.
Right.
In many respects, because Fantasia is really flat by comparison in parts of it. Not all of it, but parts of it. And so we're just back to that Pinocchio level animation.
It's like they had the level of the technology and the technique of Pinocchio, but I think they also had more artistry to go with it.
Yes.
Not to knock the art style of Pinocchio, but this is good as time as any for me to get into my new favorite artists, specifically because of this movie, Tyrus Wong.
Yes.
I was just incidentally, a few days before I watched Bambi, was at Alamo Drafthouse to watch Everything Everywhere All at Once. And Alamo always does the things before the movie. They don't have those advertisement things. They show weird stuff. Mm-hmm. Old trailers, music videos, that kind of thing. But they had a lot of interviews with the cast and crew. And then they also had a bit that was sort of like a history of Asian Americans in film, which was great. And I'm like, I really want to see if that's just on YouTube because I want everybody to watch it because it was really good. But they're just sort of going through it. And then in 1942, Bambi came out, and Tyrus Wong was really influential to the art style, and his art style was really influenced by his Chinese heritage. And I was just like, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm going to need to look this up. But I like to go in fresh, so I didn't look it up before I watched the movie. And from the first frame, I was like, there it is.
Yes.
What he was doing, what he brought, it's right there. It's gorgeous.
It is so pretty. It's even little things like when you see the forest, you see the odd birch tree, like a silver birch. And it's like, oh, here's a tree with white and silvery bark. It's just little things like that. We're like, you can tell he's studied the forests to get this right. He really did. And it is pitch perfect for me. I loved it. I really loved reading about the stories of him. There's apparently an American Masters PBS documentary about him that I have not watched yet, and I absolutely am going to. And I love the story. That's why I'm going to tell it, even though it's probably in the documentary. They had one animator who went, Maurice Day, who went to Vermont and Maine and was sketching the forest there, and he came back, and everybody was like, well, I mean, they're good. They're beautiful forests, but there's just something. And then Tyrus Wong was working as an in-betweener, which, in animation, you have your main animator who is going to draw kind of like the beginning and the end of the movement. And so you can see where it's going to start and where it's going to end. And those are very clear and very like beautifully drawn, beautifully painted. But if you actually do a lot of still shots in anything animated, you'll see a lot of the stuff in the middle of the movements is pretty junky. Right.
Because they're just sort of transitioning. And they give those jobs to the in-betweeners. And so it's just sort of a menial task. And Tyrus Wong was really sick of it. He thought it was boring and unfulfilling. And so he went home and just painted a series of paintings of forests and deer in forests. And his style is really inspired by like a traditional Chinese painting style. You can see it in these concept arts. It's beautiful. And he brought it in and he was like, I'm just an in-betweener.
He's like, so I did a thing.
Yeah, so I did a thing. I mean, how'd it go? Like, what do you think? And they loved it. Disney the man, Disney the company, everybody loved it. And so it very much like he got promoted to art director on this film and inspired basically every frame of it from that point.
And yeah.
To great effect, to beautiful effect. And the biggest, sort of most tragic part of it is that because the animator strike that started on Dumbo continued to cause huge ripple effects throughout the company, he left.
Right.
He did Bambi and he left. But then he went to go to Warner Brothers and he did concept art for like a ton of John Wayne movies, for Rebel Without a Cause. This man just like, he created the look of so many iconic movies, and the man lived to be 106 years old. And I can't believe that I had never seen his name before that shot in a preview at Alamo Drafthouse. That I had never... I went to film school. I did 7 years of film school.
Yeah.
Come on, guys. And at the time, he would have been the Chinese Exclusion Act. Meant that he immigrated to America at 9, never saw his mother again because she couldn't come to America.
Separated from his father
for a month while he like sat at Angel Island, which was not a good place. Like, this man has a story about being marginalized and discriminated against, and he still was just an amazing, amazing artist. Like, once you start looking up his art, I'm just falling in love with it left, right, and center. He also was a really successful Christmas card artist.
When you hear a story like that, to me, it's always like, can you imagine how much he could have done had he been completely unfettered by the racism, the animator strike, all that stuff? If he had just been really able to let loose, what would have come of that? If
he had really been trusted and able to do what all he could do. So I guess, never mind. We do have some racism in this one, but it's not in the movie.
Right. It's not depicted on, it's off-screen racism.
There wasn't anything that indicated, and again, I haven't watched the documentary, but there wasn't anything I read that indicated that he faced discrimination specifically at Disney.
Right.
But he did definitely throughout his life and throughout his career.
Oh, sure.
So before the strike, Disney had about 1,200 employees. And when it finally ended, they had 694.
Yeah.
Almost half of their workforce left over the working conditions over the course of Dumbo and Bambi.
All those poor people who had to work on Dumbo.
And there is some interesting stuff about who it was that stayed and who left, which projects they were working on. But it was definitely that they had their best people were on Bambi, because that was the one that where their heart was. And you can see when you watch the two of them so close together, it's so obvious.
It is.
Because there's just so much more heart in Bambi.
It is somebody phoned it in and somebody showed up and just laid it all out. It's just the difference is night and day.
It also could be possibly because of the source material. I mean, Dumbo being based on like a very sparse kids book and Bambi being based on like an actual novel for adults. It's not a hugely thick book. It's not War and Peace, but it's a novel. But they did also ditch a lot of it. Bambi's mom. Let's go ahead and tackle that situation. Because whenever you say Bambi, that's the first thing everybody thinks of is Bambi's mom. That's from the book. In the book, I think they explicitly say he gets adopted by another doe.
I had problems with that because she dies and it's just, you don't really know how much time passes between when she dies and suddenly he's an adolescent.
Because he can only grow it in one transition, not in all of them.
Yeah, I know. He goes from being like up to my kneecaps to a full-size buck in very little time. But let me just put out some of my thoughts about Bambi's mom. In one way, I actually like the fact that she dies and the great prince of the forest, from here forward, I'm going to call him the GPF. He says to Bambi, he's like, your mother can't be with you anymore. And the story trucks right along.
It's tragic. It's sad. And the way that they do it is designed to be sad. They've got this thing where they're like, you've just done this really dark section where like they're starving. They're literally starving.
Yeah.
And look, I found the first signs of spring and they're grazing. They run and she's like, don't look back, just keep running. And then when he's just like, mother, we made it. And she wasn't behind him.
Yes.
And then it starts snowing again. So spring's not here. It's still snowing. Hearing him call mother, it is all very, very sad. Like, I'm not trying to downplay that. But also, to me, it feels like an age-appropriate way to discuss death.
Yes. But also, I think in a good way, they don't dwell on it.
Right.
The movie just keeps going.
Life keeps happening.
Life keeps happening, and you don't necessarily want your young audience sitting there contemplating how they would feel if their mom died.
Right.
And so the great prince of the forest, she can't be with you anymore, and boom, the story keeps going. That's a weird choice, but also in a way, I think it's kind of the right choice.
And it's not the climax of the movie. It's like the beginning of the third act or something.
No, exactly. And that's for the best that they don't sit there and dwell on it.
You transition and it's spring.
Yes, and suddenly Bambi's a grown man.
Spring will come eventually, and
Spring will come, exactly. And you kind of don't know what happens to Bambi between those moments, except for that he quintuples in size.
Right. Every time we have time passing, I'm like, why is he still so small? Why does he still have spots?
I was thinking that too.
By the time they go to the meadow, he shouldn't have had spots anymore.
Deer usually are independent by about 1 year of age. And so he goes from teeny tiny to full grown, and we don't actually know how much time has passed. I don't really care. I don't really miss it. It's just one of those things when you're watching, you're like, what is happening with the pacing again?
He's born in spring. It's definitely spring. Then it sort of gave me this weird sense of time that, like, I'm sure if I was 7 or 8 years old, I wouldn't even notice.
Right.
But he literally stays the exact same size from being a newborn until he's a year old.
Yes.
It implies that it's overnight that he gets that big. You're having the first grass of spring. Like, spring is on the way when his mom dies and he's a baby. And then the next scene, you're in full spring, which would not be that much later, especially not in the Appalachian Mountains. The next scene, he's a teenager.
Yes, it is bizarre.
Like I said, if I was 8, I wouldn't notice. But as an adult, it just messes with my head.
Yes, but also I do think that's one of those things where you can sort of see in the evolution of the Disney feature. I was talking about this with Sean last night. They hadn't really figured out their pacing for a movie this long yet.
Right.
And I think really what it boils down to, I'm not a filmmaker. I don't really know a lot about film at all. They didn't have a feature-length story.
I think you're right. I think that they were still probably treating it, and especially if you start looking at the credits, where, like, the credits, they have sequence directors. And that's where you get some of the weird things where, like, there are some choices where, like, the fight with Rano, that scene is drawn and colored so differently from everything else. I think that they were still very much thinking of all of this as these are scenes and sequences that we're putting together, and not this is a movie that is then divided into sequences.
No, I think you're exactly right. It's because it does feel like a bunch of, I don't want to call them bits, but a bunch of bits that get strung together in a sequence. They don't have a feature-length story.
There's no necessarily a 3-act structure, because the structure is actually part of how the audience participates. And this movie still doesn't have it.
No, it really doesn't.
It has more than the others, probably because it's based on a book.
Probably so. But again, there are parts where it's just like, we're just watching a deer grow up.
Yeah.
And I sound critical, and I don't necessarily mean it to be critical, because the thing is, like, this movie's beautiful. I don't mind watching a deer grow up when it looks like this.
It's slice of life.
Yes.
It's very much a slice of life movie, but with a deer. You get ups and downs.
Mm-hmm.
You have tragic moments, but you have happy moments. The name of the book that it's based on is actually Bambi, A Life in the Woods.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is very much a year in the life. Bambi, a year in the life.
Yeah.
Although while I'm thinking about it, one of the guys, the lyricist who wrote the lyrics to the songs in Bambi, also did the lyrics for Snow White. Some of those were really good. Also did the song The World Owes Me a Living from that short about the grasshopper and the ants, which I have running through my head frequently in my life. That song made a big impression. He also was the screenwriter for Bambi. But when I look, I mean, they've got story credits. He's not the only person. And it's not even just like him and then the guy that wrote the book. They've got a lot of people that were credited. I mean, they just had a lot of hands. They had a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
For having a lot of cooks in the kitchen, they put together a fairly cohesive product at the end.
Right. There's not anything where I look at it and I say that scene was ridiculous, unnecessary, didn't do anything, didn't move anything. There's no hand washing scene in this.
Right.
And I know I'm gonna be going back to that hand washing scene for this entire podcast.
Well, that's fine because it's annoying.
It was too long and too out of place. And there's nothing like that in here.
Right.
The things that sort of made me raise an eyebrow, actually almost all are in the spring section when he becomes a teenager. But all of that's just going to have to wait until next time. So we'll see you in 2 weeks to deal with everybody being Twitter-pated. You should subscribe so you don't miss it. Revisiting the Vault is a 9-Hour Films production, and it's edited by Mary Ratliff. Our music is by Music Motion and Lynn Publishing. We are not affiliated with or authorized by the Walt Disney Company. You can find us on Twitter at Revisit the Vault, and you can find our website at revisitingthevault.com. Don't forget to check out our Patreon. Patrons can get personalized thank you cards, stickers, and access to deleted scenes and outtakes. You can find that over at patreon.com/9hourfilms. If you want to support us, the best thing you can do is to tell other people about the show, and make sure that you leave a review in whatever app you're using to listen. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.